Okay, so we looked at for loops. Now I want us to take a minute here to look at while loops. So they're a little different, at least as far as how they look. They're a little different. They still do the same thing. They still loop, which means that they execute a line or multiple lines of code repeatedly. So they basically are a means to not repeat code that you can just put inside in a loop and run repeated multiple times. But as far as when should you use one or the other, well, the truth is that for loop you typically use when you know how many times you want to loop. And so depending on the program you're working on, there might be times when you know exactly how many times you want to loop. There's maybe a variable, in this case it would be this variable loops, that determines how many times you want to loop. And a while loop is often used when you're not sure how many times you're gonna have to loop. That's typically true when you're asking the user for some sort of input and you're gonna loop until the user enters an expected phrase, for example. Like maybe you have a program that is asking for an email and a password, and so in theory you would keep asking for an email and password until the user enters the correct email and password. And so you wouldn't know how many times the user enters the incorrect email and password. And so that is where maybe a while loop would be more appropriate. And it's not to say that you can't use a for loop or a while loop in either scenario, but it is usually the case that when you don't know exactly how many times you're going to loop, you use a while loop. And when you know exactly how many times you want to loop, you use a for loop. Again, that's just typical, but not necessarily the case. And so let's look at what a while loop looks like. There's a few things that you need with the while loop. Let's start with our same example here where we want to print the numbers 1 through 10. This is from the for loop video, like the tutorial on the for loops. A while loop. So while this condition is true, keep looping. That's what we typically think of a while loop is. Now, let's say that we want to print the numbers 1 through 10. Well, what's true about a while loop is that the heading, and let me just put this back for a minute so that you can see here, that this is the heading that you use for a for loop. You need to initialize the variable to a value, write the Boolean expression, this Boolean meaning the expression that is going to evaluate to either true or false and determine whether you keep looping, and the amount that you're incrementing the variable x by, or in some cases you decrease this variable, right? And so we're in a while loop, we need to initialize the variable, and then in the for loop we had it in the heading. We would initialize it prior to the while loop, outside of the while loop. So we'd say here, we're going to use this variable x, and we're going to initialize it to 1 because we want to print the numbers 1 through 10. And then we say while, and here's where we write the Boolean expression, which we had again in the heading of the for loop. And I'll write the for loop so you can see, you can compare in a minute. And then you would say while x is less than or equal to, I put 0, but it should be 10. Like that. And so here's the expression. While this condition is true, while x is less than, a number less than, or a number equal to 10, we are going to print, so system.out.print, print a new line, whatever x is. And so you have the initialization of the variable, you have the conditional statement, the Boolean expression, and then the last thing you need to do is increment x, and that has to happen inside the loop. And so I would say x plus plus right here. Otherwise, you'll engage in what we call an infinite loop. And so the way this works is x is 1, 1 is less than 10. So this is true. 1 is less than 10. Print 1, and then increase x by 1. So now x is 2, and then you loop back and check the condition. Is 2 less than 10? The answer is yes. So print the 2, increase x by 1. So now x is 3, and then you loop back, and is 3 less than 10? The answer is yes, and you keep looping, right? And just so, well, let's run this and then check. And there we go. We printed the numbers 1 through 10. Now again, well, let me write the for loop, the heading of the for loop that we had before, so you can see how it compares. In the for loop, we initialized x here in the heading. Then we had our Boolean expression also in the heading, and then we had the amount that we're going to increase x by. And so I just want you to see, compare the two and see how they match up. This corresponds to this right here. Then the expression, the conditional statement here, x less than or equal to 10 is right there. And then we increment, that happens inside of the while loop. And so they have the same things, but in different places. So in a for loop, it would happen like this. In a while loop, it would look like this. And so we're looking at while loops now. Now it is true here that we can still, do a lot of the same things that we were able to do with the for loop. Just a quick one here is, let's suppose that we only want to print the even numbers between 1 and 10. Well, we could still use an if statement. If the remainder, we're using the modulus operator again, the remainder when I divide x by 2 is equal to 0. If that is true, then print x, right? Now, because this is just one line of code inside of the if statement, I don't need the curly braces, so I'll just leave them out for now. And then increment x by 1. And so what you'll see here is that you're gonna only print 5 values, and rather than tell you, let me show you. You only print the even numbers, 2, 4, 6, 8, and 10. However, you looped a total of 10 times. So you looped 10 times. And how do you verify that you looped 10 times? Well, outside of the if statement, because that's where we're printing, right? Outside of this statement, we could put a print statement and put the little asterisk like we did with the for loop. But what is important is for us to understand that we looped 10 times. Now, I was mentioning that while loop is typically used when we don't know how many times we're going to loop. So it's more undeterministic, if you will. And so let me show you what that would look like. Let's ask for user input. We've done it, and we've done it before. So let's take a minute to do this. This is from previous videos where we have to import a scanner. And so we have a scanner object, right? We're going to make a scanner object. So that's, if we recall here from our previous videos, before the while loop, let me make a new scanner object. So scanner in equals new scanner. And then we're going to do system.in. Now this is going to allow us to let the user enter some values. So it allows for interaction. Let me write a comment here just to say that we've made make a scanner object. In this case, in. The name of the object is in. It doesn't have to be in. It could be input. It could be anything, x, if you will. But well, we have x down here, so maybe not x. But okay, so let's say then that we're gonna allow the user to enter a number, right? And so we'd say system.out.print And we can say something like enter I don't know, -1 to stop. And let me erase this, and let's talk, because I'm gonna leave what I need for a for loop. I need this, right? And so enter -1 to stop, and then I'm gonna allow the user to enter -1. So I'm gonna say here, or I guess not -1. Let's see here. Let's allow the user to input something. So the way we do that is we need to store what the, okay. Let's allow the user for the user input. So I would say in dot, that's the scanner object is called in, and then the scanner object has a method called nextInt that allows for integers to be entered. Now, if I do this, my program is going to pause, but it's going to pause, and I'm not going to do anything with what the user enters. And so I need to store that in a variable, and so I'll call that int, and I'll call it answer, whatever answer the user enters equals, right? So once again, think of this as the mechanism that we use to pause our program and to wait for the user to enter a value, and whatever the user enters, and it's going to be it's going to be an integer, right? It's going to be stored in this variable answer. Now, how does that translate to the loop? Well, we can say that while answer, not x, while answer is not equal to, remember that if we want to check to see that something is not equal, we put an exclamation mark, to -1. What do we want to do? Well, if the user does not enter at -1, then maybe we want the user to keep entering a number. And so I'll put here enter a number, and then I'll put in parentheses enter -1 to stop, right? So we're basically asking the user to keep entering numbers. That's what we're doing. Let's see here. I'm going to comment this. So if I highlight this and then I do control and then the question mark or the dash / comments it, because I want to test this right here. So I'm going to compile and then I'm going to run. No errors is good. And notice how my program is pausing right now. It's waiting for me to enter a number. Right now I'm just going to be able to enter one number, 4, and then it stops, right? The reason I only I was only allowed to enter one number is because I only have this, the print statement. It's only there once, so it corresponds to this right here. And then the in.nextInt is also only coded once in line 10, and that corresponds to the pause that we saw. If I run it again, it's gonna once again print and wait for a number, and I put a 7 there, right? Now suppose that I want to keep asking for numbers until the user enters a -1. Well, I can have this while loop right here. So let me uncomment, Control Shift, and then the question mark uncomment. And I'm going to say that while answer is not, the exclamation mark means not, equal to -1. While this is true, while answer does not equal -1, I'm going to copy this and then I'm going to paste it here. Now, what is true is that once I declare answer to be an integer, and that's what this is, I'm declaring answer to be an int. I don't have to declare it again. I can just say answer equals. So I don't have to put the int answer equals, because if I do, Java would think that I'm trying to make a new variable that is also called answer, and I'm not trying to do that. Now, you remember the x++, I actually just deleted it. I don't need x++ because I'm not using x in my Boolean expression anymore. Before I had x less than or equal to 10. Now I'm using the variable answer. Answer is determining whether or not I'm going to keep looping. And so this line 16 actually takes care of updating the value of answer. And whereas before we were incrementing x by 1 and then looping until x was no longer less than 10 or equal to 10. Now we're going to keep looping until answer is until answer is equal to a -1. And so I can get rid of the x. I'm not using it anymore. Right here, once again, I have the initialization of answer. Checking the condition, the Boolean expression, also answer, not equal to -1. And then I'm updating answer. It is analogous to what we have seen in the previous while loop, but before I had here int x equals 1, while x is less than or equal to 10, and then I had x plus plus. And so if I run this, and let me compile first. Control B compiles, Control R runs, and now you see it says enter a number. Okay, let me enter a number. Let me put 8. And then it asks again, because 8 does not equal -1, so now we're in here. The first time that we are asked is this time. And now we check to see if answer is a -1. It is not, it is an 8. And so while answer does not equal -1, ask again. So now we're in the loop right here. And so if I put a 10, 10 would be stored in answer right here. Right, this is where we're pausing. So answer is going to equal 10. And then we're going to loop back, and it's while 10 does not equal -1, 10 does not equal -1. That's a true statement. So we're going to ask again. Oh, accidentally. And it keeps asking. And you can keep doing this. And so we're still looping, and you can put any number, really, as long as it's not too big of a number that it doesn't fit in an integer. And then it says enter -1 to stop, so I'll enter -1. And there. Stopped. Again, a great example of why maybe a while loop is more appropriate than a for loop. Right here, the user, in this case, we're also the user because we're the ones using the program, we're running it. The user is the one that determined how many times we looped. This first print statement comes from here. That means that we looped a total of 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 5. 5 times we looped. There is one more thing that we should mention here in this particular example here, and that's a do while loop. Do while. Do while loop. Now, a do while loop is the exact same thing as a while loop, but a do while loop basically guarantees that we run the line of code within the while loop at least the minimum of 1 time. What am I saying? I'm saying that if I run here this code on line 9, I'm going to ask for a number, and then on line 10 I'm going to wait for the user to enter a number. And if the user enters -1, -1 does not equal -1, this would be false, and so we never actually go in the loop. And you can see that if I run this and I put a -1, then my program stops. It terminates, which means that I never entered here. I never went in here. And so a do while loop allows for us to execute this right here. It's actually a perfect example. This is a perfect example of where a do while loop would be maybe the best thing that we should be using. Let me show you how a do while loop works. We're going to say do. So notice how the keyword do highlights. That's important. And then we're going to put what we want to do. And then we're going to write the while and then the condition like that. Okay? And so notice these two are the exact same, right? The only difference is that this has the name, the data type int. So they're the exact same thing. And so we've repeated our code here, and there is a mnemonic, I believe, or an acronym in programming that says it's DRY, D-R-Y. Don't repeat yourself. So try to avoid repeating yourself, and we just did here. And so I'm gonna take this line of code here. I'm gonna copy it, and I'm gonna paste it here. These 2 lines of code, right? And so we're gonna do these 2 lines of code, and then we're gonna check this condition. Now that means that I can actually get rid of this. And as a matter of fact, I can get rid of this. There's just one thing that I am gonna have to do, and that's to declare the variable answer, like that. Again, this is a declaration. Answer is an integer. I didn't initialize it, meaning I didn't set it equal to anything, like that. I didn't. So I declared it. And so answer is an integer, and a do while loop guarantees that we execute these 2 lines of code at least once. And so what we're gonna do is we're gonna execute these 2 lines of code. The user is gonna enter a value, which is gonna be stored in answer. And if answer is not equal to a -1, we're gonna loop back and do this again. And then if answer does not equal -1 when it's entered here, we're gonna loop back and do this again, and so on and so on. We can keep looping. And so if I compile this, I need to terminate this with semicolon. Forgot the semicolon. If I compile, notice how this works fine. And if I run, right here, you see how I'm being asked enter a number. That means that we came in here. We entered the loop. That's the only place where you have enter a number. Before we had it out here, we don't anymore. So enter a number, and that's this right here. So if I enter a -1, this is going to be false. Answer is not equal to a -1. It's going to be false. And so we would not loop. And let me show you how that works. We'd put a -1, and then we exit the loop because this is evaluated to a false statement. But if I run again, and now I put, so I'm in here again. I came inside of the loop, the do while loop. I'm in here, equals, and I'll put an 8, for example. And 8 does not equal -1. This is a true statement. And so I looped back, and I am doing this again, doing these 2 lines of code. And if I enter a 10, again, 10 is not equal to -1. This is a true statement, so I'm looping back and I'm doing this again. I'm asking for another number, and you're going to keep asking until the user enters a -1. And so if I put -1, I exit my loop, my program ends. A while loop and a do while loop are the exact same thing, with the key difference being that the do while loop is going to execute everything inside of the loop at least once, at the very least once. And this is a great example of where you want to ask for a number because you want to initialize the variable answer, and then check to see if it does not equal -1. And if that answer does not equal -1, then you want to keep looping until finally the answer might be equal to -1. Again, because the user is entering the values here, we don't know how many times the while loop is going to loop. We don't know how many iterations we're going to get. Right here for this example, there was 1, and then 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 iterations. So we looped a total of 6 times. In a for loop, because in a for loop in your heading, and let me write it one more time so you can see. Good thing is that this is not too lengthy. In our heading, you've basically set how many times you're going to loop. You start x at 1. X is going to increase by 1 every time, and I'm going until x is less than or equal to 10. And so you know that you're going to loop 10 times. You've somewhat tied your hands here with the heading itself. Whereas in the loop, in the while loop, you don't know what answer is going to be because this is determined by the user. The user is inputting the value that is going to be stored in the variable answer. And then you check the condition. Key difference. Now, again, it's not to say that I couldn't have used a loop here, a for loop, but we'd have to use what we call a break out of the loop. Like that. And you could do something like if, I'm just kind of giving you an idea of how you would use it, how you would do all this with a for loop. You could do something like if maybe the user enters, you're asking the user for a value and you're storing that in x. If x is equal to -1, then break out of the loop. Not as neat as doing a do while loop. And so again, is it possible to use a for loop where a while loop might be best suited? The answer is yes. What is true is that where you might typically use a for loop because you know how many times you need to iterate, using a while loop is just as convenient. And so basically you can use a while loop, I would say, anywhere, and obviously I'm generalizing a lot here, but you can use a while loop in place of a for loop probably on almost every single scenario. But it's not true that using a for loop instead of a while loop is as convenient. Right here, it is most convenient to use a while loop. Could you do it with the for loop? Yes, but it's not as neat. We'd have to use this break out of the loop statement, and it's okay to use it, but why go through this if we have a perfectly good mechanism for allowing for loops that are not necessarily deterministic, that you don't know how many times you're going to be looping. Again, we're in class, when we meet, we'll work on examples that have to do with looping, allowing for some user input. The best example I think out there, and that we're gonna definitely work on, is maybe like a username and password example where you're looking for a specific username and password, and if you don't have the specific username and password, then you would ask again. And how do we do that? We use a do while loop or just a while loop, either one, but ask for a username. So you here maybe type please enter a username, store the username in a variable, something like, instead of answer you can call the variable username, and then ask for a password, and if the password and the username are correct, then exit the loop, otherwise keep looping, right? So just an example of how a while loop works. Please check out the other videos. Watch again if you have any questions, or reach out to me if you have any questions.